Well, let's bring in three members of Parliament now to discuss the latest developments on the response to the blockades on a day when the Commons Public Safety Committee begins its study into the funding, including foreign funding, of the ongoing protests in Canada. Taleeb Noormohamed is a British Columbia Liberal MP and a member of the Public Safety Committee. Dr. Stephen Ellis is a Nova Scotia Conservative MP. And Alistair MacGregor is the Public Safety Critic for the NDP, also a member of the committee, and he is also a British Columbia MP. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here. Mr. Noormohamed, look, I'll get to the investigation at committee into foreign interference in the Canadian protests in a minute, but let me start with the debate in the House today on the call for a plan from the Prime Minister by the end of this month for lifting all federal pandemic mandates. Will your party support that motion?
I think our party is going to support the science, and we need to be guided by science. We cannot be making decisions on the back of what crowds want us to be doing. This is about making decisions that's based on science. We're going to do what public health experts tell us to do, as we have done for the last 2 years. And that's what's gotten Canada to be in the state that we are, which is one of the...
So is that to say that there isn't enough science in front of you, you believe, to present a plan for when, a timetable for when restrictions might be lifted?
I mean, I think anyone who reasonably can predict exactly what is going to happen with variants and how those variants will respond and react deserves the Nobel Prize right now, because I think we have to follow the science and make the right decisions. Okay. And so it's impossible to say we're going to have a plan on this day and that day without actually understanding all of the facts that are at play.
Okay, let me move to your colleagues here. Stephen Ellis, I want you to weigh in on that and where we are in the science as it relates to federal mandates. I also want you to talk to me about your interim leader, Candice Bergen, had previously said Conservatives shouldn't press for protesters to leave because they were creating a problem for Justin Trudeau. But today she's asking the protesters to do just that, to end their protest. What's changed?
Thanks for having me here, Peter. I think it's really, really important that Canadians begin to understand that this is a failure of Liberal leadership. Once again, we've seen this for the last 2 years. They have no plan. They have never had a plan. They're always too little, too late, not at the right time. And again, sadly, what we continue to see is the spin doctors not listening to real doctors and how they need to at least have a plan in moving forward. Canadians are beginning to lose hope here, sir. And I think that is the most important narrative that Canadians want us politicians to understand and portray for them, that we need a plan going forward here to lift these federal mandates.
Why are Conservatives now telling protesters it's time to go home?
Well, I think, it's very, very clear. In the beginning, Canada's Conservatives are very, very supportive of people who have the right to peaceful protest and respectful protest. It's very, very clear also that when the protesters worked outside of those guidelines, Canada's Conservatives were quick to condemn them. And I also think that when protests become more than that and they're not serving a useful purpose, then Canada's Conservatives, who are the party of law and order, are going to step forward and say, hey, you know what, it's time to move on with this. You've made your point. We brought the Opposition Day motion forward now to end mandates.
Mr. MacGregor, your leader called on the Prime Minister to show leadership to end the protest, but wasn't quite specific on exactly what should happen. He did say we should call in the U.S. ambassador to answer questions about foreign funding. But what more should the Prime Minister be doing, and where does the NDP stand on this motion?
Well, the Prime Minister is showing a lack of leadership on this issue. And, the situation has gotten worse, going all the way back to the election when vaccinations were politicized. And, we used to be in a state in this country in 2021 where we were all in this together. And then the issue of vaccinations got politicized. In terms of leadership, we now have a situation where 2-3 major border crossings going into the United States are being blockaded by protesters. This is clear federal jurisdiction. We need the federal government to step up, show leadership. And the reason why is because we have so many workers and so many businesses that are suffering from this. The irony is that these anti-lockdown protests are now themselves causing lockdowns. And so Canadians are stuck between the lack of leadership from the federal Liberals and the Conservatives who are playing footsie with all of the extremists who are causing all these lockdowns. It's an extremely frustrating position to be in.
All right. Mr. Noormohamed, let me talk about the protests. And the specific focus began in hearings today looking into millions of dollars raised for the protesters through crowdsourcing platforms. A lot of money is coming from outside Canada, that's clear, including from U.S. donors. You also successfully expanded the study to look into the funding of extremist groups. So what are you after with this study?
It's important for Canadians who are giving to good causes to be able to know that they can contribute to the causes that they believe in. But there is a line, right? And I think that line is when foreign actors start to fund things that disrupt, that cause extremist-based violence in Canada, that promote hate in Canada. We have to stand up to stop that. And I think it's particularly important given, we saw conservatives over the course of the last 2 weeks, as Mr. MacGregor said, play footsie with some incredibly bad elements. They had no problem, even after there were swastikas, even after there were Confederate flags, continuing to have coffee with these folks, continue to engage with them. So it's time for us to step up and say, look, there is no room for this in Canada. And if foreign actors are going to be funding stuff like this, we've got to put a stop to it.
Dr. Ellis, you weren't at the committee. You're not on that committee, but I know I think you've been briefed on what sort of went on there. But I can tell you I watched it. The GoFundMe officials will appear before that committee on March 3rd. They collected $10 million before they shut down the fundraiser. But the protesters are now raising millions more from other crowdsourcing platforms. But I heard officials from FinTrack, Canada's financial intelligence unit, say today that so far they've seen nothing suspicious or worrisome in the fundraising for these protests. So what do you want to know about where the money's coming from?
I think there's a couple of things here that are really important. My colleagues continue to use this disparaging and inflammatory language, which is not really settling down the whole issue. And I really want to call people out on that. That's what the Prime Minister's done that's really created part of this problem. And that's unfortunate that my colleagues want to pick up and use that same style of language. Secondly, I think that what Canadians want to see is transparency in the processes. So bringing the GoFundMe people in front of the committee, I think that makes perfect sense because if this government wants to continue to act it the way they are now, it's unlikely that this will be the end of protests and the end of funding of many groups to come. Because quite frankly, sir, Canadians are fed up with the style of leadership, lack of leadership, let's be honest, that continues here, and the division of Canadians, which is really not a way to lead a country. It's not the way to lead a business. It's not the way to lead anything. A hockey team.
Mr. MacGregor, you heard from officials from FinTrack today. Are you satisfied that mechanisms are in place to track suspicious contributions? They said so far they haven't seen anything that worries them to this point. Are you convinced any laws have actually been broken by those foreigners who are supporting the protests?
I think FinTrack laid the table nicely for the start of this study. Let's not forget that in April of last year, another crowdfunding site, Give, Send, Go, a data breach occurred. It was found that they were funneling money towards groups like the Proud Boys. So I think we need to explore this. That's why I brought forward the original motion last week. It's why Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, brought forward an emergency debate motion in the House of Commons, why my colleague Heather McPherson is working at the Foreign Affairs Committee to call the United States ambassador. We have serious questions about this. And in terms of inflammatory language, you need look no further than some of the convoy organizers about some of the extremism that they're supporting. We have very serious concerns about American donations.
Just hang on a second, Dr. Ellis. Just hang on. Let him finish his point. Then. Hang on. Let him finish. Go ahead, Mr. MacGregor.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know a lot of the donations are coming from the same people in the United States who thought that January 6th was legitimate political discourse. I don't think Canadians want that type of rhetoric or political leaning coming into our country.
But have they broken the law? The laws in this country prohibit outside sources from putting funds into election campaigns and so on. But
that's precisely what our parliamentary committee will be investigating. We owe it to ourselves, to Canadians as policymakers, to ensure that any gaps that exist in the legislation are filled.
Okay, Dr. Ellis, let me hear you want to jump in.
I think what's important here is what I'm trying to understand is why my colleagues want to continue to be inflammatory with respect to this and how the words that they choose, not the words that protesters want to use. Canadians do have freedom of expression and free speech. I think that's important. I just can't understand.
But Dr. Ellis, if there were
continue to be inflammatory with what they want to say and the words they choose.
If there are groups that are connected to the January 6th events in the United States that help fund that, if they are funding protests in Canada, would you want to know that?
Peter, what I'm actually calling out is the colleagues and their style of language. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that they want to be inflammatory here. Of course, why would Canadians not want to know who is funding this and to be transparent in our government? What I'm calling out of my colleagues is the disparaging and divisive language that's been brought forward here on the show, and sadly continues to be used by the Prime Minister as he refused to do anything to bring Canadians together, show real leadership, and allow these things to be finished.
Mr. Noormohamed, I got a quick a few seconds here for a final comment from you.
You know, this is exactly what you're seeing. This is precisely how the Conservatives continue to gaslight Canadians. These are folks that the Conservatives have had no problem at all playing this when it's convenient for them, and as soon as their internal polling shows that Canadians don't like what is happening in Ottawa, they don't like what these protests stands for, all of a sudden they change their tune. They have not been interested in doing anything at all to bring Canadians together.
That's our time. That's our time. Listen, gentlemen, I wish we had more time to continue the conversation. We'll have another chance, but I thank you all for joining me to talk about it tonight. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.